Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the frozen Scottish Highlands during the dead of winter, where you'll discover exactly why your modern camping gear wouldn't stand a chance against what Highland clans endured in their snow tents. Picture this. It's 1645, a blizzard's roaring across the mountains, and you're about to spend the night in a structure that's basically animal skins draped over sticks, packed around with snow that's supposed to insulate you but mostly just makes you feel like you're sleeping inside a walk-in freezer. The temperature's plummeting to around -15°C. Your breath crystallizes the moment it leaves your mouth, and the only thing between you and hypothermia is a communal pile of unwashed bodies, a sputtering peat fire, and several layers of wool that smell like they died twice. You probably won't survive this, but let's see how far we get. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this community spread across every time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a highland glen, somewhere in the Grampian Mountains, and the wind's hitting you like frozen razors. Your guide, a grizzled clan member named Highlander who hasn't smiled since 1642, gestures toward what looks like a lumpy snowdrift about 15 feet across. "That's home," he grunts, and you realize with creeping horror that he's pointing at the snow tent. The Gaelic term is Bedtime, which sounds mystical and romantic until you understand it literally translates to snow hut, which is exactly as terrible as it sounds. The structure before you is ingenious in the way that desperation breeds innovation. Picture a dome-shaped framework of flexible branches, typically hazel or willow, whichever the clan could forage from lower elevations before the winter locked in. These branches are bent into arches and lashed together with leather strips or twisted heather rope, creating a skeletal frame about 5 feet high at the center. Over the skeleton, layers of deer hides, sheepskins, and cowhides have been draped and weighted down with rocks. But here's where it gets interesting. The entire structure has been banked with snow, packed tight against the hides to create an insulating layer. In theory, snow's actually an excellent insulator. It traps air pockets and can maintain a temperature differential of 20 or 30 degrees between inside and outside. In practice, you're still going to freeze. Highlander pulls aside a heavy flap of deerskin, the door, though calling it that feels generous, and gestures for you to crawl inside. The entrance is deliberately low, designed to prevent heat loss, which means you're immediately on your hands and knees in the snow, scrambling through an opening that's maybe 2 feet high. Your modern sensibilities are screaming about claustrophobia, about fire codes, about the fact that there's literally one exit and you just crawled through it into what amounts to a skin-covered igloo. Inside, the darkness is absolute until your eyes adjust to the dim orange glow of the peat fire burning in a shallow pit at the center. The ceiling's low enough that you can't stand. You're either crouching, sitting, or lying down, and those are your only options for the next 12 to 14 hours until dawn. The space is roughly circular, maybe 12 feet in diameter, and it's already occupied by 7 other people from Highlaster's extended family group. They're arranged around the fire like spokes on a wheel, their bodies wrapped in plaids, those versatile woolen blankets that serve as clothing, bedding, and basically every textile need a Highlander has. The smell hits you next. It's a layered assault on your senses. Peat smoke, which has this earthy, almost sweet quality but also makes your eyes water immediately. Unwashed wool, which is essentially wet sheep's smell concentrated and aged like a fine cheese nobody asked for. Human bodies that haven't bathed since probably October, and underneath it all a musty, organic scent of the hides themselves, some of which still have traces of the animal fat used to cure them. One of the modern documentaries you half-watched mentioned that Highland warriors could smell an enemy camp from a mile away in winter, and you'd always assumed that was exaggeration. It wasn't. You settle into a spot Highlander indicates, squeezing between a teenage boy who doesn't acknowledge your existence and an elderly woman who's muttering something in Gaelic that sounds either like a prayer or a curse. Honestly, your money's on curse. The ground beneath you is a combination of heather branches laid down as a mat, then covered with more hides to create a barrier between you and the frozen earth. It's marginally better than sleeping directly on snow, but only marginally. The cold seeps up through the layers regardless, finding its way into your hip bones and shoulder blades, the parts of you that press down with your body weight. Here's what the history books don't really emphasize. Highland clans didn't use these snow tents because they were effective or comfortable. They used them because during winter transhumance, the practice of moving livestock to different grazing areas, or during clan conflicts when they needed to stay mobile, these were the only shelters that could be constructed quickly with available materials. A skilled group could raise a Bedtime in about 3 hours, provided they had the materials ready. Speed mattered more than comfort when you were fleeing a rival clan or when a storm was rolling in fast over the mountains. The fire in the center is your only heat source, and it's a masterclass in minimalism. Peat, decomposed vegetation cut from bogs and dried, burns slower and longer than wood, which makes it ideal for situations where you can't exactly pop outside every hour to gather more fuel. The problem is that peat produces a lot of smoke, and in an enclosed space like this, that smoke has to go somewhere. You glance up and notice a small opening at the apex of the tent where the branches meet, a smoke hole about 8 inches across. In theory, the smoke rises and escapes through this opening. In practice, the wind outside keeps shifting direction, and every few minutes a gust blows down through the smoke hole and sends the fire's smoke billowing directly into your face. You cough, your eyes streaming, and the teenage boy next to you makes a sound that might be a laugh. Welcome to the Highlands. Alastair is explaining something in a mixture of Gaelic and broken English about the fire maintenance schedule. Apparently, everyone takes turns throughout the night feeding small pieces of peat to keep it alive, but not so large that it overheats the space or consumes too much precious fuel. You're trying to pay attention, but you're distracted by the fact that your fingers are already going numb despite being inside the shelter. You tuck your hands under your armpits, and the woman next to you, the possible curse mutterer, wordlessly hands you a corner of her plaid to wrap around your shoulders. It's scratchy. It's greasy from lanolin and smoke and body oils. It's the warmest you've felt since entering this frozen hellscape. The social dynamics inside a Bedtime are fascinating if you're an anthropologist and absolutely maddening if you're someone who values personal space. The people in this tent represent 3 generations of the same family group, plus you, the inexplicable time traveler they're apparently tolerating. Sleeping arrangements aren't assigned by comfort or preference. They're organized by a complex hierarchy of age, gender, status, and practical considerations like who's responsible for the fire watch and who needs to be near the entrance for various reasons. Children and elderly get the spots furthest from the entrance, where the cold draft is less severe. Adult men typically arrange themselves near the entrance, both for defense purposes. If something or someone tries to get in, they're the first line of resistance, and because cultural expectations dictate they should endure the worst conditions. Women are distributed according to family structure, often positioning themselves to care for children or elders while also maintaining their own warmth. You, as the outsider, get whatever space is left, which in this case is a spot that's directly in the smoke stream when the wind shifts north. Historians still argue whether these sleeping arrangements were as rigidly enforced as some Victorian-era accounts suggest, or if they were more fluid depending on circumstances. What's clear from surviving oral histories is that maintaining harmony in such cramped quarters was essential. One person's restlessness or snoring could make everyone miserable. And when you're facing 14 hours of darkness together, social cohesion isn't just polite, it's survival. The fire pops, sending up a small shower of sparks, and everyone reflexively leans away. One errant spark landing on the dry hides above could turn the shelter into an inferno in seconds, and there's that single exit to keep in mind, the one you crawled through, the one that's currently blocked by 2 sleeping bodies and someone's pack of supplies. Fire safety in a Bedtime is basically be extremely careful and pray a lot, which is not exactly the reassuring protocol you might hope for. Outside, the wind picks up, and you hear it moaning across the mountains, a sound that's both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The snow banking around the tent shudders and settles, and for a moment you wonder if the whole structure might collapse inward. But the framework holds, the hides strain against their bindings, and everything creaks like a ship in a storm before stabilizing again. This is going to be a long night. The construction of a Highlander Snow Tent is one of those things that seems simple until you actually try to build one, at which point you realize your ancestors were significantly more competent than your college degree led you to believe. Alastair, sensing your modern confusion about how this pile of sticks and dead animals is actually keeping you alive, begins explaining the engineering in a mixture of demonstration and gruff instruction that makes you feel like you're failing a survival course you didn't sign up for. The foundation starts weeks before you ever need the shelter. Clans would harvest flexible branches during autumn, specifically hazel, birch, or willow, and store them in a way that maintained their pliability. These weren't random sticks grabbed in desperation. They were carefully selected for length, diameter, and flexibility. A proper frame requires roughly 12 to 16 poles, each about 10 to 12 feet long and thick as your thumb. The poles get planted in a circle in the snow, their ends shoved down until they hit frozen ground or at least stable subsurface layers, then bent inward and lashed together at the apex to create that dome shape you're currently huddled under. The lashing technique itself is a skill passed down through generations. Using leather thongs or twisted heather rope, both of which maintain some flexibility even in freezing temperatures, the builders would secure each intersection point with a specific knot that could be tightened but wouldn't slip under stress. Historians still argue whether the clans used a variant of the clove hitch or something more specialized. But what's documented is that these joints had to withstand not just the weight of the hide covering, but also the accumulated snow load and the constant buffeting of wind that could gust up to 70 miles per hour on exposed highland ridges. You watch as Alastair points to where one of the poles meets another, showing you the wrapped binding that's holding everything together. It looks almost casual, like someone just twisted some rope around a few times and called it good. But when he tugs on it to demonstrate, the entire structure barely shifts. The engineering principle at work is tensegrity, though obviously Alastair doesn't use that term. The poles are under constant tension, pushing outward while the bindings and the weight of the covering pull inward, creating a stable structure through balanced opposing forces. It's the same principle behind modern geodesic domes, except your version is made from materials that were literally alive last season. The hide covering is where things get really interesting and also really disgusting by modern standards. The skins draped over your head right now come from deer, sheep, and at least one cow, all butchered during the autumn slaughter when clans would reduce their livestock numbers before winter scarcity hit. These hides weren't tanned in the modern sense. There was no chrome tanning process, no industrial chemicals. Instead, they were cured using a combination of methods that sound like medieval alchemy and smell worse than you can imagine. The most common curing method involved brain tanning, which is exactly what it sounds like. Animal brains contain natural oils and enzymes that, when worked into a hide, break down the proteins and preserve the skin while keeping it supple. The process required someone to literally mash up the animal's brain, mix it with water to create a paste, then massage it into every inch of the hide before stretching and drying it. The resulting leather is soft, water-resistant to a degree, and absolutely reeking of a smell that your modern nose categorizes as biological warfare. Alternative methods included using urine, yes, really, as the ammonia helped preserve the hide and break down organic matter. Some clans would soak hides in a mixture of oak bark and water, using the tannins in the bark for preservation. The elderly woman next to you, noticing your fascination with the hide above your head, taps it with one gnarled finger and says something in Gaelic that Alastair translates as "Deer from 3 winters past, brain tanned by her daughter, still good. 3 winters. You're sleeping under a blanket of animal skin that's been in continuous use for 3 years, accumulating smoke and moisture and who knows what else, and it's still considered good. Your camping tent from REI started leaking after 1 season. The layering of the hides is strategic, not random. The innermost layer, the one you're staring at right now, consists of the softest, most pliable skins, typically deer or sheep, because they'll be in direct contact with the inhabitants and need to be less abrasive. These are overlapped like shingles, with each hide positioned so that water or melting snow runs downward and outward rather than seeping through the joints. The outer layers are thicker, heavier skins, often cowhide, which provide additional structure and weather resistance. Between some of the layers, you can see dried heather or grass stuffed as extra insulation, creating dead air spaces that trap heat. Then comes the snow banking, which is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the whole design. You're essentially piling the very thing you're trying to escape, snow, against your shelter. But here's the quirky scientific tidbit that makes it work. Snow is roughly 90 to 95% trapped air, and air is an excellent insulator when it's not moving. A foot-thick layer of packed snow around the tent's exterior can maintain an insulation value roughly equivalent to modern fiberglass insulation, provided the snow is the right consistency, not too powdery, not too wet and heavy. The clan members who built this particular Bedtime spent about an hour packing snow against the hides, working methodically from bottom to top, creating a bank that's thicker at ground level where heat loss is greatest and tapering toward the apex where the smoke hole needs to remain clear. The teenage boy who keeps ignoring you apparently spent his afternoon on snowpacking duty, which explains why he's now completely passed out despite the cramped conditions. That's exhausting work in sub-zero temperatures. The entrance design deserves special mention because it's deceptively clever. That low tunnel you crawled through isn't just an arbitrary height. It's deliberately positioned below the level of the interior floor space. This creates what modern builders would call a cold sink. Cold air, being denser than warm air, settles in that entrance tunnel rather than flowing into the main chamber. Meanwhile, the warmer air inside the tent rises toward the smoke hole, but can't escape quickly because the opening is relatively small. The result is a temperature gradient where the floor might be barely above freezing, but at head height when you're sitting it could be 10 or 15 degrees warmer. Of course, warmer is relative. You're still looking at interior temperatures that hover around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius on a good night, which is cold enough that you can see your breath but warm enough that you won't die of exposure if you're properly bundled. The peat fire contributes some radiant heat, but it's surprisingly inefficient. Most of its heat goes straight up and out the smoke hole. What the fire really provides is psychological comfort and enough warmth to prevent the interior from becoming completely uninhabitable. The structural integrity of the Bedtime depends on constant maintenance throughout the winter season. Alastair explains that every few days, weather permitting, someone has to go outside and check the snow banking for gaps or collapse, repack areas where wind has eroded the coverage, and inspect the hide bindings for stress or deterioration. During heavy storms, snow accumulation on the roof becomes a genuine concern. Too much weight and the whole framework can collapse inward, potentially trapping or injuring everyone inside. There's a documented account from the early 1700s of a Bedtime collapse during a storm that killed 2 children and injured several adults before the survivors could dig their way out. After that incident, at least according to clan oral traditions, groups started implementing a safety protocol where one person would periodically go outside during heavy snowfall to sweep accumulated snow off the roof. Imagine volunteering for that job, crawling out into a blizzard every couple hours to brush snow off your tent while the wind tries to peel your face off. The materials for a single snow tent represent significant resource investment. Those 12 to 16 poles took hours to harvest and prepare. The hides represent multiple animals, each of which was valuable for meat and other purposes. The leather bindings, the heather bedding, the peat fuel, all of it had to be gathered, processed, transported, and rationed. A clan group might have 3 or 4 Bedtimes worth of materials stored and ready for winter deployment, but that was about the limit of what they could manage given the resource constraints of Highland life. What's fascinating from an anthropological perspective is how these structures fit into the broader pattern of Highland seasonal movement. During winter, clans would often split into smaller family groups, each taking their portion of the livestock to different glens or sheltered areas where grazing was still possible. The snow tents allowed these groups to remain mobile even in deep winter, following the animals as they foraged, rather than being locked into permanent settlements. This mobility was both a survival strategy and a defensive advantage. A scattered clan was harder for enemies to target than one consolidated in a single fortified location. But mobility came with trade-offs. Everything you needed had to be portable. That meant limited supplies, minimal tools, and constant exposure to elements that could kill you if you made a single mistake. The tent you're sitting in represents the absolute minimum shelter necessary for survival, engineered through generations of trial and error. And yes, through deaths of people who got it wrong, whose tent collapsed or whose fire went out or who made any number of fatal errors that you won't even know you're at risk of making until it's too late. Alastair prods the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the smoke hole, and mentions almost casually that the framework of this particular Bedtime has been used for 4 seasons now. The poles get taken down in spring, stored in a dry location over summer and autumn, then reassembled when winter comes. 4 years of repeated stress, bending, binding, weathering, unbending, and these branches are still holding up several hundred pounds of hide and snow. You think about the IKEA bookshelf you assembled last year that's already sagging in the middle, and you feel a certain shame about modern craftsmanship. The woman next to you shifts position, tugging her plaid tighter and inadvertently pulling the shared corner away from your shoulder. The cold immediately finds the gap, and you realize just how precarious your warmth is. It's not something you have, it's something you're temporarily borrowing from the collective heat of 8 people, one struggling fire, and a pile of animal skins that smell like they died defending their honor. Outside, the wind shrieks across the mountains, testing every binding and stress point of your shelter, and you start to understand why Highland clans developed a reputation for being harder than frozen iron. They didn't have a choice. The fire situation in a Highlander Snow Tent is basically a continuous exercise in choosing which way you'd prefer to die, freezing, suffocating, or burning alive, and then trying to navigate a razor-thin margin between all three. You're staring at the peat fire right now, watching it smolder with that dull orange glow, and Alastair is explaining the rules with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for handling explosives, which, given the circumstances, isn't far off. First, let's talk about what peat actually is, because understanding your fuel source is critical when that fuel source is also slowly poisoning you. Peat is partially decomposed organic matter, mostly sphagnum moss, but also heather, sedges, and whatever else grew in the bog over the past several thousand years. It forms in waterlogged conditions where decomposition is slowed by acidity and lack of oxygen, creating these dense, carbon-rich layers that Highlanders would cut into brick-sized chunks, dry for weeks, and then burn as their primary fuel source. It's renewable on geological timescales, which is to say, completely non-renewable by any practical human measure. When peat burns, it smolders rather than flames, producing intense heat relative to its size, but also producing unholy amounts of smoke. The smoke isn't just annoying, it's genuinely toxic. Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, particulate matter, and various organic compounds all billow off burning peat. And in an enclosed space like this Bedtime, those gases have nowhere to go except into your lungs. That smoke hole at the apex of the tent is your only ventilation, and it's maybe 8 inches in diameter, trying to exhaust the emissions from a fire that's been burning for 3 hours and will need to burn for at least 10 more. The mathematics of this are terrifying when you think about them. Modern building codes require a certain number of air changes per hour to prevent carbon monoxide buildup, typically 4 to 6 complete air exchanges. Your tent has maybe 12 cubic meters of interior volume, and that smoke hole, even with a decent draft, is probably managing to exchange only a fraction of that per hour. You're essentially hotboxing yourself with peat smoke, and the only reason you're not already unconscious is because the tent isn't perfectly sealed. Those gaps between the hides, the entrance tunnel, the various imperfections in the construction, they're all allowing just enough fresh air to seep in that you're only mildly poisoned rather than dead. Alastair points to the fire pit itself, which is surprisingly sophisticated for something that looks like a shallow hole in the ground. It's been lined with flat stones to prevent the fire from melting down into the snow base and to radiate heat more effectively. The stones themselves were selected carefully. River rocks are avoided because they can explode when heated due to trapped moisture, a quirky and terrifying fact that you really wish you'd known before now. The chosen stones are dense, heat-resistant types, probably granite or similar, that can withstand repeated heating and cooling without fracturing. The fire is never allowed to flame dramatically because flames consume oxygen rapidly and produce less sustained heat than smoldering coals. Instead, the peat is arranged in a specific pattern, larger chunks at the bottom creating a coal bed, smaller pieces on top that gradually catch and add to the ember mass. Airflow is controlled by how tightly the pieces are stacked. Too much air and you get flames that waste fuel and overheat the space, too little and the fire dies out completely. It's a Goldilocks situation where you're trying to maintain just enough combustion to stay alive without triggering any of the dozen ways this can kill you. The teenage boy whose sleeping spot is next to yours apparently has fire-watching duty for the next 2 hours. He's not actually asleep like you thought. He's in that semi-conscious state where he's aware enough to monitor the fire but resting enough to conserve energy. Every 20 minutes or so, he stirs, prods the peat with a metal rod that looks like it was once part of a sword, and adds a piece of fuel about the size of your fist. Too much at once and the fire flares, sending smoke billowing into everyone's faces and raising the interior temperature to uncomfortable levels. Too little and the fire dwindles. The cold creeps in, and you've got the dangerous task of rebuilding it from nearly nothing. Here's what the romantic histories of Highland life conveniently omit. People absolutely died from carbon monoxide poisoning in these tents. It's just that nobody really tracked it as a distinct cause of death. Someone would go to sleep and simply not wake up, and the clan would attribute it to the cold or to age or to the will of God, not realizing that the invisible, odorless gas from their own fire had stolen the oxygen from their blood while they slept. Modern analysis of Highland mortality records, such as they exist from this period, shows suspicious clusters of winter deaths that align with what we now recognize as CO poisoning symptoms. The smoke itself, even setting aside the carbon monoxide issue, is a constant irritant. Your eyes are watering continuously, and you're developing a cough that you suspect is going to last for weeks if you survive this night. Everyone else in the tent has the telltale signs of chronic smoke exposure: reddened eyes, a persistent throat-clearing habit, and likely some degree of lung damage that just gets accepted as normal. The elderly woman next to you has a cough that sounds like it's rattling around in her chest, and you wonder how many winters she's endured in conditions like this, how much smoke she's inhaled over a lifetime of bothans and stone cottages with inadequate ventilation. The fire management rotation is taken seriously because falling asleep on your watch can have catastrophic consequences. If the fire dies completely, restarting it in the middle of the night is a nightmare scenario. Flint and steel fire starting in a tent full of smoke, with frozen fingers and precious tinder that might be damp from condensation. Success isn't guaranteed. There are documented accounts of families huddling in the dark for hours, trying desperately to resurrect their fire while the temperature inside the tent plummeted. Some succeeded, some didn't, and when the thaw came months later, searchers would find them frozen together. But if the fire grows too large, you've got an equally terrifying problem. Those hides above your head are dry, smoke-cured leather that will ignite if exposed to direct flame or sustained sparks. The heather bedding beneath you is essentially kindling. The woolen plaids everyone's wrapped in will burn enthusiastically once they catch. And remember that single exit, the one that's currently partially blocked by sleeping bodies and gear? In a fire, you've got maybe 30 seconds to get everyone out through a 2-foot opening while smoke and panic turn the interior into chaos. Fire safety protocols in a Bathan are passed down through oral instruction and grim experience. Never stand the peat chunks vertically where they might topple. Never add fuel without checking the smoke hole for blockages. Snow can accumulate around the opening, restricting airflow and causing dangerous backdraft. Never, under any circumstances, fall asleep within 3 feet of the fire pit unless you want to wake up with your plaid smoldering. And never let the fire go completely out because the tinder pouch is only packed with enough material for 2, maybe 3 restart attempts. Historians still argue whether some clans used a banking technique where they'd cover the fire with ash and turf before sleep, creating an insulated coal bed that could smolder for 8 to 10 hours with minimal attention. The advantage was uninterrupted sleep. The disadvantage was reduced heat output and an increased risk of the coals dying entirely beneath their covering. Alastair's family apparently doesn't trust this method. They maintain an active watch rotation all night, which means someone is always awake, always cold, always breathing smoke, taking one for the team so everyone else can rest. The smoke patterns inside the tent are hypnotic and awful. When the wind outside is calm, the smoke rises in a relatively straight column toward the escape hole, and you can almost breathe normally if you keep your head low. But Highland winds are never calm for long. A gust hits the tent, the smoke hole becomes a downward funnel, and suddenly you're engulfed in thick, choking smoke that makes your eyes stream and your lungs seize. Everyone reflexively covers their faces with whatever fabric is handy, breathing through wool that filters out some of the particulate matter but definitely not the carbon monoxide. There's an art to positioning yourself in the tent to minimize smoke exposure. The spots closest to the ground are clearer because smoke rises, basic physics that probably saved countless lives even if nobody understood the thermodynamics involved. The spots near the entrance tunnel get better air circulation but are also the coldest. The premium positions are those at middle height on the side opposite the prevailing wind, where you're elevated enough to benefit from the fire's warmth but not so high that you're perpetually choking. You don't have a premium position. You have whatever spot was left when you arrived, which appears to be directly in the smoke stream when the wind shifts to the northeast, which it does about every 7 minutes. You're learning to anticipate the wind changes by the sound it makes against the hides. A particular whipping flutter that gives you about 5 seconds warning to bury your face in your plaid before the smoke redirects into your personal space. The fuel supply is stored at the perimeter of the tent, stacked carefully to stay dry and accessible. Alasdair mentions that this Badhan has about 3 days' worth of peat currently stockpiled, which sounds reassuring until you do the math. 3 days means if a storm pins you down, if going outside becomes impossible due to whiteout conditions, or if someone is injured and the group can't move, you've got 72 hours before you're burning anything combustible you can find. Extra hides, wooden tools, the framework of the tent itself, just to maintain enough heat to survive. Running out of fuel is one of those slow-motion disasters that Highland clans faced with grim regularity. You burn through your peat supply faster than anticipated because the temperatures dropped lower than expected, or because someone misjudged the weather and thought you'd only be in this location for 2 days instead of 5. The fire gets smaller. The cold creeps in. People start making calculations about whether it's better to risk sending someone out into a storm to find more fuel or to huddle together and try to survive on body heat alone. The fire pops loudly, and a spark lands on the hide above, glowing briefly before the teenage boy reaches up with wet fingers and snuffs it out. He doesn't even fully wake up to do this. It's such an automatic response that his body handles it while his brain stays in whatever dream he's managing to have in these conditions. You count the scorch marks on the hides above the fire pit and stop at 27. 27 times that something almost caught fire, 27 near misses that didn't turn into the catastrophe you're increasingly certain is inevitable. The psychological toll of managing fire in these conditions is something nobody really talks about in the historical accounts. You can't relax. Ever. Even when it's not your watch, even when you're exhausted and desperately need sleep, part of your brain is always monitoring that fire, listening for the sounds that indicate problems, ready to jolt awake if something goes wrong. It's a kind of hypervigilance that probably contributed to the general stress levels of Highland life, never fully resting, always one spark away from disaster. Alasdair adds another piece of peat to the fire, and the smoke thickens perceptibly. Your headache, which had faded to a dull throb, surges back with renewed intensity. That's probably the carbon monoxide talking, competing with oxygen for binding sites in your hemoglobin, making every cell in your body slightly less efficient at the basic task of staying alive. You'll survive tonight, probably, but you're going to wake up with a pounding headache, a throat that feels like you've been swallowing sandpaper, and a new appreciation for why so many Highland survivors emigrated to places with central heating the moment they had the chance. The fire smolders on, indifferent to your suffering, doing its half-hearted job of keeping you alive while simultaneously trying to kill you. Welcome to the paradox of Highland winter survival. Now let's talk about sleeping arrangements, which is a polite way of saying how you're going to spend the next 10 hours pressed against strangers in a position that would violate multiple modern personal space conventions while parasites conduct a full exploration of your scalp. The floor space in this Badhan measures maybe 12 feet across, and there are 8 of you sharing it, which gives each person approximately 11 square feet of personal territory. That's less space than a prison cell, and unlike a prison cell, you don't get walls between you and your cellmates. You're arranged in a radial pattern around the fire, heads toward the perimeter, feet toward the center, like some kind of human wheel that's missing most of its spokes. This configuration maximizes the number of people who can fit while ensuring everyone gets at least some radiant heat from the fire on their feet, which are typically the first extremities to go numb in freezing conditions. Your feet, currently wrapped in what Alasdair called brogues, basically rawhide shoes stuffed with dried grass for insulation, are pointed toward the fire pit, close enough to feel warmth but not so close that you'll wake up to the smell of your own feet cooking. The teenage boy to your right is maybe 6 inches away from you at the closest point. The elderly woman to your left is even closer because she's curled slightly in your direction, probably seeking warmth. Her breathing is raspy and irregular, punctuated by that wet cough that makes you think about tuberculosis and all the other respiratory ailments that must have run rampant through populations living in constant smoke exposure with no concept of germ theory. Every time she coughs, you feel the vibration through the hide you're both lying on, and you try very hard not to think about disease transmission. The bedding beneath you consists of a layer of heather branches, springy when fresh but now compressed into a mat that's about as cushioned as cardboard, topped with animal hides that are doing their best to separate you from the frozen ground. The hide directly under your body is deer, you think, based on the size and texture, and it's been used so many times that it's developed a permanent depression in human body shape. You're not the first person to sleep in this exact spot, and you won't be the last, and everyone who's been here before has left a little bit of themselves behind in the form of body oils, sweat, dead skin cells, and probably lice. Let's talk about the lice situation, because it's unavoidable and also horrifying. Body lice, Pediculus humanus corporis for those keeping track, thrive in conditions exactly like this. Unwashed bodies in unwashed clothing in close proximity with minimal exposure to cold temperatures that might kill them. These tiny parasites live in the seams of woolen fabric, coming out to feed on human blood several times a day, causing itching that ranges from mildly annoying to genuinely maddening. Everyone in this tent almost certainly has lice. The question isn't whether you'll get them, you will, but how quickly and how many. The wool plaids that everyone's wrapped in are lice metropolises. These blankets haven't been washed since last spring. Washing wool in winter is basically impossible when all your water sources are frozen and drying anything in sub-zero temperatures takes days. Instead, the plaids get aired out occasionally when weather permits, and the theory is that exposure to cold and sun will reduce the parasite load. The theory is optimistic. In practice, the lice burrow deeper into the fabric during cold exposure and emerge enthusiastically when the wool returns to warm human proximity. You can feel something crawling on your scalp right now. You're trying to convince yourself it's just hair movement or imagination, but deep down you know the truth. Welcome to the 17th century, where everyone itches all the time and that's just accepted as normal background misery. The communal sleeping arrangement isn't just about maximizing space. It's a critical survival strategy based on shared body heat. Humans generate about 100 watts of heat at rest, roughly equivalent to a dim light bulb. 8 humans packed closely together create a collective heat output of 800 watts, which in a well-insulated space, and remember, snow is actually decent insulation, can raise the ambient temperature significantly. The people on the outer ring, nearest the walls, suffer more from cold than those in the middle positions, which is why the elderly and children get priority for inner spots while able-bodied adults take the perimeter. But shared warmth comes with shared everything else. The man across from you shifts in his sleep and kicks out, his foot connecting briefly with someone else's leg before settling. Someone mutters something in Gaelic that's probably a curse. The teenage boy beside you is snoring with a congested, wheezing sound that suggests his sinuses are as smoke-damaged as yours are becoming. Every movement by one person creates a cascade of minor disturbances as bodies shift, plaids are tugged, and cold air infiltrates the warm pockets that each sleeper has carefully cultivated around themselves. Privacy is a modern luxury that you've just realized you took completely for granted. There is no privacy here. If you need to relieve yourself during the night, and you will, because the cold makes you need to urinate more frequently as your body shunts blood away from extremities, you have 2 options. Option 1. Crawl over sleeping bodies to the entrance, exit the tent into sub-zero darkness, and handle your business outside while trying not to get frostbite on any exposed anatomy. Option 2. Use the communal piss pot that's positioned near the entrance, which means everyone hears everything and the smell contributes to the already impressive olfactory assault that is this tent's interior atmosphere. Historians still argue whether Highland clans in winter Bathans practiced the kind of strict nighttime silence that some Victorian accounts describe, or if the reality was more relaxed with normal conversation and movement throughout the night. What seems clear from oral histories is that excessive noise or disruption was socially sanctioned. Making it difficult for others to sleep wasn't just rude, it was potentially dangerous when everyone needed rest to survive the next day's demands. The children in the tent, there are 2 you've realized, though they're so quiet and bundled you initially missed them, are positioned between adult bodies for maximum warmth. One is maybe 4 years old, the other perhaps 7, and they're sleeping in that boneless way children do, completely trusting that the adults around them will keep them alive through the night. That trust is both touching and terrifying when you consider how many things could go wrong: fire, collapse, carbon monoxide, freezing, and how little actual control anyone has over those outcomes. The sleeping positions themselves are dictated by what works in confined space. You can't sprawl. You can't even fully extend your legs in most positions because your feet would be in the fire or kicking someone in the head. Most people sleep slightly curled, either on their sides or backs, with their plaids wrapped tightly around them to trap body heat. The plaids serve as sleeping bags, blankets, and additional insulation layers. And the way you wrap them is apparently an art form that you're completely incompetent at. Alastair had to show you 3 times how to fold and wrap the plaid properly. A specific technique involving pleating the fabric, lying down on it, then wrapping the layers around yourself while tucking strategic sections to prevent them from coming loose when you move. Your attempt looks like you lost a fight with a blanket. His looks like a precisely engineered thermal management system. The difference in warmth retention is noticeable. He's comfortable enough to drowse off immediately while you're still shivering and readjusting. The woman next to you shifts and her plaid falls away from her shoulder, exposing skin to the cold air. She doesn't immediately wake, but within 30 seconds her body's thermoreceptors have registered the heat loss and she stirs, fumbling the fabric back into place with practiced, half-asleep movements. This happens dozens of times throughout the night for everyone. The constant micro-adjustments to maintain warmth, the semi-conscious monitoring of your body's thermal status, the exhausting work of just staying warm enough to keep sleeping. Body odor in this environment is a multi-layered sensory experience that you're becoming intimately familiar with. There's the base layer of unwashed human, which is actually not as terrible as you'd expect. People who never bathe develop a different, less acute smell than people who bathe regularly and then skip a few days. Then there's the smell of smoke-infused everything, which partially masks organic smells. Layer in the lanolin from the wool, the leather smell from the hides, a hint of urine from the direction of that communal pot, and the general mustiness of enclosed spaces, and you've got an aroma that's distinctly Highland winter survival, and completely unlike anything you've encountered in your temperature-controlled, regularly showered modern life. The breathing sounds of 8 people create this weird rhythmic symphony. Some breathing quietly through their noses, others mouth-breathing because their sinuses are completely clogged with smoke irritation. One person with a slight whistle, the elderly woman with her irregular, congested pattern. You find yourself unconsciously syncing your breathing to the general rhythm, and you wonder if that's some kind of pack-bonding instinct or just your brain trying to find patterns in the chaos. Someone passes gas, you're not sure who, and honestly it doesn't matter because in these close quarters there's no hiding it and also no point in being embarrassed. It happens. Everyone's digestive system is processing the same diet of oats and preserved meat and fermented dairy, and intestinal gas is just another thing you endure together. The Victorians who later romanticized Highland life conveniently left out the parts about shared farts and midnight tents, but here in reality, it's just another sensory data point in the overwhelming experience of communal winter survival. The physical discomfort of lying on a semi-frozen hide on top of compressed heather on top of snow-covered ground is cumulative. For the first hour, it's tolerable. By hour 2, your hip bone feels like it's drilling into the ground and your shoulder blade has gone numb from pressure. You shift position, trying to find a comfortable spot, and immediately feel the cold air rush in where your body had warmed a small pocket. It's a constant trade-off. Move and lose your accumulated warmth, or stay still and let pressure points become genuinely painful. The teenage boy next to you has clearly mastered the art of sleeping in these conditions. He's motionless except for his breathing and the occasional twitch of fire-watching duty. He's probably been doing this since he was the age of those younger children across the fire, learning season by season how to endure, how to conserve energy, how to wake just enough to tend the fire and then drop immediately back into sleep. For him, this is normal. For you, this is a night you'll remember forever, assuming you survive it with enough mental function intact to form long-term memories. There's a psychological phenomenon happening that you're starting to recognize, the lowering of expectations. 3 hours ago, you would have considered these conditions absolutely unacceptable. Now, you're just grateful that you're inside something instead of outside in the full force of the wind, that there's a fire instead of total darkness, that there are other humans instead of dying alone. Your baseline for acceptable comfort has shifted so dramatically that the fact you can't feel your toes seems like a minor inconvenience rather than the beginning of potential frostbite. The elderly woman coughs again, a deep, productive sound that makes you wince in sympathy. She doesn't wake fully, just coughs, swallows, and settles back into her raspy breathing pattern. You wonder how old she actually is. In this era, elderly might mean 45 if life's been particularly hard. The fact that she's survived this many winters in conditions like this marks her as genuinely tough, someone who's endured more hardship in her normal life than you've experienced in your entire modern existence. Sleep, when it finally comes for you, will be fragmentary and unsatisfying. You'll drift off for 20 minutes, then jolt awake when someone moves or coughs or the fire pops, then drift off again, then wake to tend your watch shift, then maybe get another hour of broken rest before dawn. It's not restorative sleep. It's survival sleep, but it's enough to keep you alive for another day, and in the Highland winter, that's literally all that matters. Around what you estimate is midnight, though without any way to check and with the complete darkness outside offering no clues, Alasdair announces it's time for a meal, which is exciting until you see what constitutes food in a Highland snow tent. The teenage boy, roused from his half-sleep, produces a leather sack from somewhere in the shadows and begins distributing items that look less like food and more like props from a horror film about medieval famine. First comes the oatcakes, which are essentially flat discs of oats mixed with water and salt, then cooked on a hot stone and dried to the consistency of particularly aggressive cardboard. Alasdair hands you one, and you turn it over in your hands, marveling at how something made from a grain you associate with wholesome breakfast can feel like a roofing tile. The instructions are simple. Break off pieces and soften them in your mouth with saliva before attempting to chew, because trying to bite directly through a dry oatcake is an excellent way to crack a tooth. And dentistry in 1645 consists of pull it out with pliers and hope you don't die of infection. You attempt to bite. The oatcake has the flavor profile of basically nothing. Unsalted oats taste like what you'd imagine poverty tastes like, with a texture that somehow manages to be simultaneously rock-hard and dusty. As you work it around in your mouth, trying to generate enough saliva to make it chewable, you notice everyone else is eating theirs with the practiced efficiency of people who've been doing this their entire lives. The elderly woman has no teeth left, you realize, and she's gumming her oatcake into submission with a determination that's both impressive and depressing. Next comes what Alasdair calls crowdie, which is a type of fresh cheese made from the milk of whatever hardy cattle or goats the clan managed to keep alive through the winter. The sample he hands you looks like cottage cheese's poor cousin who fell on hard times, and the taste is aggressively sour. They've used rennet and acid to curdle the milk, and in the absence of refrigeration, everything has that fermented edge that tells you beneficial bacteria are racing pathogenic bacteria in a competition to colonize the food before it colonizes you. The crowdie is actually one of the better things you'll eat tonight, which tells you everything you need to know about the rest of the menu. It provides protein and fat, both desperately needed in this cold environment where your body is burning calories just to maintain core temperature. You scoop it with your fingers, no utensils, because extra equipment means extra weight when traveling, and try not to think too hard about where those fingers have been and when they were last washed. The answer to both questions is, you don't want to know. Then Alasdair produces the blood pudding, and your modern sensibilities finally encounter something they cannot process without gagging. It's a section of sheep intestine, stuffed with a mixture of blood, oatmeal, and animal fat, then boiled and now served cold because reheating it over the peat fire would require effort and fuel that nobody's willing to spare. The casing has the texture of a balloon that's been left out in the sun too long, and when you bite into it, because refusing food in this environment is both rude and stupid when calories are survival, the interior has a grainy, metallic taste that your brain correctly identifies as blood that has coagulated and been mixed with grain. It's awful. It's also probably keeping everyone in this tent alive. The blood provides iron and protein, the oatmeal provides carbohydrates for energy, and the fat provides the caloric density needed to fuel bodies working hard in extreme cold. Your disgust is a luxury that Highland clans couldn't afford. When an animal was slaughtered, every single part got used, and blood was far too valuable to waste just because it wasn't appetizing. The teenage boy is eating his portion of blood pudding with the blank expression of someone consuming fuel rather than enjoying food. There's no pleasure in this meal, no savoring of flavors or textures. It's mechanical. Bite, chew, swallow, repeat until the food is gone and your stomach has something to work with. The Victorian romantics who later wrote about simple Highland fare clearly never spent a winter midnight choking down cold blood sausage in a smoky tent while wondering if dysentery was going to be a problem. Alasdair passes around a leather flask containing what he calls bland, which turns out to be fermented whey, the liquid left over from cheesemaking, inoculated with bacteria and allowed to develop into a sour, slightly alcoholic beverage that tastes like someone mixed buttermilk with vinegar and sadness. You take a cautious sip and immediately understand why Highlanders developed a reputation for drinking whiskey, anything to wash away the taste of bland. But water sources are frozen solid right now, and melting snow over the fire uses precious fuel. so bland it is. The fermentation actually makes it safer to drink than untreated water, killing off pathogens that could cause illness, so you're literally drinking spoiled milk as a health measure. The meal continues with dried meat, probably venison from the autumn hunt, preserved by being cut into thin strips and dried in the smoke of peat fires until it achieved the consistency of leather boot tongues. You're supposed to tear off small pieces with your teeth and chew them slowly, letting saliva rehydrate the meat enough to make it swallowable. It's a workout for your jaw muscles, and the flavor is intensely smoky with an underlying gaminess that reminds you this was once a wild animal that definitely wasn't grain-fed or quality-controlled. Historians still argue whether Highland winter diets provided adequate nutrition or whether most people were operating in a state of chronic malnutrition during the hardest months. What's clear from skeletal remains is that dental health was generally terrible, not from sugar, which was rare and expensive, but from the grit and hardness of foods like these oatcakes, plus the general wear of chewing dried meat and the abrasive quality of stone-ground grains. Tooth loss was common and started young, which made eating these already difficult foods even harder as people aged. There's also the delightful option of sowens, which one of the quieter clan members produces from another sack. Sowens are made by steeping oat husks in water for days until they ferment, then straining off the liquid and allowing it to settle into a gelatinous substance that can be eaten cold or heated. The batch you're being offered has the consistency of wallpaper paste and a sour, yeasty smell that makes your stomach preemptively object. It's gray. Food should not be gray unless it's a deliberate culinary choice at a fancy restaurant, and this is definitely not that. You eat the sowens because everyone else is eating theirs and because refusing food in this context would be genuinely insulting to people who've shared their limited winter stores with you. It tastes like sour oatmeal that's been left to die in a corner, but it's also filling in a way that the other foods aren't. It sits heavily in your stomach, providing that sensation of fullness that helps combat the constant low-level hunger that's probably normal for everyone here. The children get priority on the crowdie and the fattier portions of the blood pudding, you notice. The adults are eating more of the oatcakes and dried meat, reserving the most nutrient-dense foods for the youngest members who need calories for growth in addition to warmth. It's a quiet form of sacrifice that happens without discussion or recognition. The elderly woman takes a smaller portion of crowdie and passes more to the 4-year-old without comment. This is how survival works in conditions where there's not quite enough for everyone to thrive, just barely enough for everyone to persist. The caloric content of this meal is probably adequate, maybe 600 to 800 calories, which combined with whatever was eaten during daylight hours might total 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day. In normal conditions, that would be enough. But in extreme cold, your body can burn 300 to 400 calories per day just maintaining core temperature and performing basic winter survival tasks. Everyone in this tent is operating at a caloric deficit, slowly burning through fat reserves and then muscle mass, getting leaner and more vulnerable with each week of winter that passes. There's a communal pot of something that looks like porridge but smells like it's been cooking since last Tuesday, which it probably has. This is the perpetual pot method. You keep a pot of oats or grains cooking slowly at the edge of the fire, adding water and new oats as needed, never emptying it completely. The bottom develops a crusty layer of scorched grain, and everything tastes faintly burnt and smoke-infused. But it's hot food, and hot food in a freezing tent is worth its weight in whatever Highlanders used for currency. You take your portion of the porridge, served in a wooden bowl that's been carved from a single piece of wood and has probably never been properly washed, just scraped clean between uses, and the warmth of it against your hands is almost as valuable as the calories. The porridge has the texture of library paste and tastes primarily of smoke and oats, with occasional chunks of something you can't identify and have decided not to investigate too closely. You eat it anyway. Your modern palate is screaming in protest, but your cold, exhausted body is just grateful for fuel. The meal concludes with what Alastair presents as a treat, a small piece of tablet, which is essentially sugar and butter boiled together until it solidifies, creating a primitive candy that's incredibly sweet and rich. Your piece is approximately the size of a die, and it's probably worth more than you realize. Sugar was expensive, butter was precious, and combining them into candy was a genuine luxury. The sweetness explodes across your taste buds after all that sour and smoky food, and for about 30 seconds you understand why people talk about simple pleasures. The aftermath of the meal involves no cleanup because there's nothing to clean. The wooden bowls get stacked near the entrance, The leather flasks get stoppered and tucked away, and everyone wipes their hands on their plaids or directly on the hides they're sitting on. Food particles that fell during eating are simply ground into the floor covering, adding to the general ecosystem of the tent. You think about bacteria and food poisoning and all the health code violations happening simultaneously, and then you remember that germ theory won't be established for another 2 centuries, and everyone here has an iron constitution forged by constant low-level exposure to pathogens. Your stomach is processing this meal with sounds that are audible to everyone in the quiet tent. Gurgles and rumbles as your digestive system tries to figure out what to do with blood pudding and fermented whey and mystery porridge. You're going to have interesting bathroom experiences in the near future, assuming you survive long enough to have bathroom experiences. The teenage boy makes eye contact with you and smirks slightly, and you realize he can hear your intestines complaining and finds it amusing. The meal has taken maybe 20 minutes from start to finish, and now everyone's settling back into their sleeping positions, slightly warmer from the food, marginally more comfortable with something in their stomachs. The peat fire continues its smoldering. The smoke continues its assault on your respiratory system, and you continue your slow education in why Highland clans were so enthusiastic about emigrating to literally anywhere else the moment they got the chance. But for tonight, you're fed, you're relatively warm, and you're surrounded by people who've been surviving winters like this for generations. Whether that's comforting or terrifying depends entirely on how optimistic you're feeling about your odds of seeing morning. The concept of hygiene in a Highlander Snow Tent exists on a spectrum that ranges from minimal to what hygiene, and you're about to get an intensive education in exactly how low human standards can sink when survival trumps cleanliness. The last time anyone in this tent had what you would recognize as a bath was probably sometime around October, which means you're now 4 months into a winter where nobody has been fully immersed in water for purposes of cleaning. This isn't because Highland clans were particularly dirty by choice. It's because bathing in winter in the Highlands is somewhere between impractical and suicidal. Water sources are frozen. Heating enough water for a bath would require burning precious fuel for hours. Getting wet and then trying to dry off in sub-zero temperatures is an excellent way to develop hypothermia, and staying wet in these conditions practically guarantees frostbite. So instead, everyone just doesn't bathe. They live in their accumulating layers of dirt and sweat and smoke residue, and their bodies adapt in ways that would horrify a modern dermatologist. The wool plaids that everyone's wearing have become essentially bonded to their owners through a combination of body oils, lanolin from the sheep the wool came from, smoke absorption, and general grime. The teenage boy's plaid has visible stains in different shades of brown and gray, creating an unintentional camouflage pattern that's actually quite effective for blending into Highland landscapes. The elderly woman's plaid is so stiff with accumulated substances that it holds its shape even when she's not wearing it, standing up like a fabric sculpture dedicated to the concept of well-worn. Your modern understanding of bacteria and skin flora is making this situation much worse than it needs to be. Everyone in this tent is covered in a thriving ecosystem of microorganisms that have adapted to life on unwashed human skin. The good news is that human skin produces antimicrobial compounds that prevent most harmful bacteria from taking over. The bad news is that you can literally see the results of 4 months without proper washing. Visible dirt in skin creases, blackened fingernails, necklines where grime has accumulated into distinct bands. A last stare catches you staring at your own hands, which after just a few hours in the tent have already picked up a layer of soot and grease. And he says something in Gaelic that sounds like it's probably teasing. The teenage boy translates with obvious amusement. He says you look like you've never seen your own dirt before. It's accurate. Your hands at home are cleaned multiple times daily with soap and hot water. Your hands here are tools that touch food, touch hides, touch the ground, touch your face, and never get cleaned with anything more aggressive than occasionally wiping them on fabric. Hair maintenance in winter is particularly grim. Nobody's hair has been washed since autumn, which means everyone's scalp has developed a protective layer of sebum, natural oils produced by the scalp, that's actually helping insulate their heads and protect against the cold. The downside is that this oil layer has trapped dirt, smoke particles, and those lice we discussed earlier, creating a situation where everyone's hair has essentially turned into matted, greasy ropes. The children have it slightly better because their hair is shorter, but the adults have these elaborate situations happening on their heads that you're trying very hard not to examine too closely. The women generally keep their hair braided or tied back, which at least contains the situation somewhat. The men either have shortish hair or have tied it back with leather thongs. Nobody has combed their hair recently. Combs exist, but using them on hair this tangled and greasy is an exercise in frustration and pain. Instead, people just periodically run their fingers through to work out the worst tangles, and they live with the rest. Lice management happens through a combination of tolerance and occasional manual removal. You watch the elderly woman pick through the 4-year-old's hair, catching lice between her fingernails and crushing them with the practiced efficiency of someone who's been doing this her entire life. It's social grooming behavior that serves both practical and bonding purposes, but it's also a Sisyphean task. You can never eliminate all the lice, just reduce their numbers temporarily before they breed back to previous levels. The situation with clothing is that nobody's removing any of it for the duration of winter. The layers that went on in October are staying on until April, accumulating wear and tear and bodily secretions the entire time. The innermost layer, usually a linen or lightweight wool shirt, is theoretically absorbing sweat and protecting the outer layers. But after 4 months, that inner layer has become a crusty shell of dried sweat and body oils that's probably capable of standing up on its own if removed. Historians still argue whether some Highland clans practiced a form of clothing rotation where they'd have 2 sets of inner garments and would swap them out periodically, hanging one set in the cold to freeze clean while wearing the other. The theory is that freezing kills some bacteria and parasites and freshens the fabric somewhat. The reality is that most people just wore what they had continuously because they didn't own multiple sets of anything. Foot hygiene deserves special attention because your feet are critical for survival and also because they're experiencing conditions that would make a podiatrist weep. Those brogues you're wearing, the rawhide shoes stuffed with dried grass, are doing their best, but they're not waterproof. Snow and moisture inevitably seep in during the day, and then you're spending nights trying to dry them near the fire without actually cooking them. Meanwhile, your feet are wrapped in wool leg coverings that haven't been changed since you put them on, and they're marinating in a combination of sweat, moisture from snow infiltration, and the general funk of being enclosed in poorly ventilated footwear. Trench foot, the condition where prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions causes tissue breakdown in the feet, is a genuine risk that Highland clans dealt with pragmatically by checking their feet regularly and trying to keep them as dry as possible. Alastair demonstrates this by unlacing his brogues and peeling back his leg wrappings to reveal feet that are pale, slightly swollen, and have areas of skin that look concerningly soft and wrinkled. He prods them clinically, checking for loss of sensation or signs of tissue damage, then wraps them back up. This is preventative medicine in the Highlands. Notice problems before they become catastrophic and adjust accordingly. Your own feet are already experiencing the early stages of cold damage. Numbness in the toes, that pins and needles sensation when you move them, the aching cold that settles into the bones. You attempt to check them like Alastair did, struggling with the unfamiliar lacing system of the brogues, and when you finally get them off, the smell that emerges is impressive in its intensity. The teenage boy actually leans away, and the elderly woman says something in Gaelic that's definitely not a compliment. The dried grass insulation in your shoes has become compressed and damp, losing most of its insulating value. Alastair hands you a fresh bundle of dried grass from the supply pile. They actually maintain stockpiles of this stuff because it's critical for foot warmth, and demonstrates how to fluff it and pack it into the shoes properly. It's a nightly ritual for anyone who wants to keep their toes. Remove shoes, check feet for damage, replace wet grass with dry grass, rewrap feet in whatever leg coverings you have, put shoes back on. Skip this routine, and you're risking frostbite and potential amputation if gangrene sets in. Dental hygiene is a concept that hasn't really been invented yet in any systematic way. People occasionally chew on twigs to clean between teeth. The fibrous wood acts as a primitive toothbrush, and some clans use coarse cloth to rub soot or salt onto teeth as a cleaning agent. But actual brushing and flossing are centuries away from being common practice. The result is that everyone over the age of about 20 has some degree of dental decay, gum disease, and general tooth loss happening. The diet actually helps somewhat. The low sugar content means cavities develop more slowly than they would in modern times, but the abrasive quality of the food wears down enamel and creates other problems. The elderly woman is missing most of her molars, which explains why she was gumming that oatcake earlier. The teenage boy has teeth that are stained dark from smoke exposure and probably some decay, but they're still mostly intact. Alastair has a gap where a tooth was extracted, probably with pliers and no anesthesia beyond possibly some whiskey, and the gum has healed over into a smooth depression that he pokes with his tongue habitually. Your own teeth, pampered by fluoride and regular dental checkups, suddenly feel incredibly precious. You run your tongue over them, appreciating their smooth enamel and complete presence in your mouth, knowing that a single toothache in these conditions would be absolutely unbearable with no access to antibiotics or proper dental care. Wound care in this environment is primitive and terrifying. Any cut or scrape has the potential to become infected in conditions where everything is dirty and there's no concept of sterilization. Alastair shows you a scar on his forearm, a long, ragged line where something clearly cut deep, and explains through broken English that it happened 2 winters ago. He treated it by washing it with whiskey, packing it with moss that supposedly had healing properties, and wrapping it in cleanish fabric. The fact that it healed without killing him is partly luck, partly the antibacterial properties of whiskey and certain mosses, and partly his immune system working overtime. The teenage boy has chilblains on his fingers, those painful, itchy swellings that develop from repeated exposure to cold followed by rapid rewarming. They're red and slightly swollen, and he treats them by basically ignoring them and hoping they don't develop into full frostbite. There's no treatment beyond protecting them from further cold exposure and hoping they heal on their own, which they usually do, though they'll probably recur every winter for the rest of his life. Frostbite prevention is a constant concern that everyone monitors cooperatively. People check each other's exposed skin for the telltale white or grayish patches that indicate tissue freezing, and they alert each other to cover up or warm affected areas before permanent damage occurs. Your nose and cheeks are already feeling the constant ache of cold exposure, and the woman next to you wordlessly adjusts her plaid to create a fabric windbreak that protects your face somewhat. It's a small kindness that might prevent you from losing the tip of your nose to frostbite. The lack of bathing has created a situation where everyone's skin has adapted in ways yours hasn't. Their skin is tougher, more weathered, with a thicker protective layer that's developed through years of this lifestyle. Your skin, used to regular washing and moisturizing and protection from elements, is already cracking and drying in the cold, developing painful splits at the corners of your mouth and around your knuckles. Alastair notices this and offers you a small amount of animal fat to rub into the cracks. It's rancid smelling and probably not sterile, but it creates a moisture barrier that provides immediate relief. Personal grooming is reduced to absolute minimums. Nobody's trimming nails regularly, so everyone has long, blackened fingernails and toenails that would horrify a manicurist. Nobody's doing anything about excess body hair beyond occasionally hacking at beards with a knife if they get too unwieldy. Women's body hair is just accepted as normal because removing it would serve no practical purpose and would be a weird use of time and resources. The overall effect is that everyone in this tent looks like they've been living rough for months, which they have. They're thin, dirty, smoke-stained, wearing clothes that are more patched than original fabric, and they smell like a combination of peat fire, unwashed bodies, wool grease, and various animal products. And this is normal. This is what winter survival looks like when you strip away modern conveniences and face the elements with nothing but what you can carry and what you can endure. You're absolutely disgusting by modern standards, and you're going to stay that way until spring, and that's just how it is. Welcome to reality. As the night deepens and the wind outside builds to a sustained howl that sounds like the mountain itself is screaming, the atmosphere inside the tent shifts into something more primal. The fires burn down to a bed of glowing coals, casting barely enough light to make out shapes, and in the darkness, the stories begin. This is apparently a Highland tradition, filling the long winter nights with tales that serve as entertainment, education, and psychological fortification against the very real terrors that exist just outside the hide walls. Alastair starts speaking in Gaelic, his voice dropping to that storytelling cadence that's probably been used for thousands of years. And even though you don't understand the words, you can hear the rhythm of it, the building tension, the dramatic pauses, the moments where his voice drops to barely a whisper. The teenage boy translates in fragments, giving you the gist. Something about a traveler who ignored warnings about staying off the mountains during winter and was found frozen solid, standing upright in the snow, his eyes still open and staring at something nobody else could see. The children are supposedly asleep, but you can see their eyes gleaming in the firelight, wide awake and listening to every word. Ghost stories and cautionary tales are how clan knowledge gets transmitted. Don't go out in blizzards. Respect the mountains. Understand that nature will kill you without malice or mercy if you make stupid decisions. The story ends with the frozen traveler being left where he stood because moving him would bring bad luck. And supposedly he's still there. A permanent ice statue serving as a warning to anyone foolish enough to venture into his glen. Then the elderly woman starts speaking, and her story is different. Something about the slough. The unforgiven dead who fly through the night skies in winter, trying to capture living souls to join their restless company. The protocol, if you hear them, is absolute silence and stillness, because they're attracted to sound and movement. Everyone in the tent goes quiet as she speaks, and you realize this isn't just a story to them. This is genuinely believed folklore that shapes behavior. That emphasis on nighttime silence you noticed earlier, partly practical, partly based on supernatural beliefs that discourage making noise after dark. Outside, right on cue, something makes a sound. Probably just the wind hitting the tent at a particular angle, but it produces a drawn-out wailing that sounds disturbingly like human voices in distress. Everyone in the tent goes absolutely still, and you feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The rational part of your brain knows it's just wind. The primal part that's been sitting in darkness listening to ghost stories is significantly less certain. The sound fades, and after a long moment, the elderly woman continues her story, satisfied that she's made her point. The slough passed over without incident because everyone remained silent and still. See? The old ways work. You're starting to understand how supernatural beliefs can become self-reinforcing. If the prescribed behavior also happens to be good survival practice, staying quiet and still in your shelter rather than wandering around in darkness, then every time you survive the night, it confirms the belief system. Historians still argue whether Highland folklore was genuinely believed by most people, or whether it was more of a cultural framework that everyone participated in while maintaining varying levels of actual faith in the supernatural elements. What's documented is that the beliefs influenced behavior significantly. Certain places were avoided, certain nights were considered particularly dangerous, certain rituals were observed with real seriousness. The teenage boy contributes a story about the Bean Nye, the washerwoman who appears at rivers before battles, cleaning the burial clothes of those about to die. He claims his uncle saw her before a clan skirmish 2 years ago and survived only because he immediately turned around and went home instead of joining the fight. Practical result: his uncle didn't participate in a battle where several clan members died. Supernatural explanation: he heeded the death omen and escaped his fate. Either way, he's still alive, and the story reinforces the idea that paying attention to omens can save your life. Between the stories, there are long stretches of silence broken only by the wind, the fire's occasional pop, and someone's congested breathing. The darkness is absolute whenever the fire burns low. No streetlights, no electronics, no ambient light pollution from cities hundreds of miles away. When the teenage boy lets the fire die down too much during his distraction with storytelling, the blackness becomes so complete that you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. It's disorienting and claustrophobic, and also strangely peaceful in a way that modern life never achieves. Then you hear it. A howl unmistakably canine, coming from somewhere not nearly far enough away. Everyone in the tent becomes alert immediately. That's not wind. That's wolves, and wolves in winter are desperate, hungry, and willing to investigate any potential food source, including tents full of humans. Alastair says something sharp in Gaelic, and the teenage boy immediately builds the fire back up, adding enough peat to create actual flames that provide light and the illusion of security. Wolves are a genuine threat that Highland clans deal with pragmatically and fearfully in equal measure. The last wolves in Scotland won't be eliminated until the 1700s, and in your current time period, they're still common enough in remote areas to be a real danger, especially to livestock and occasionally to humans who are alone or vulnerable. The tent provides some protection. Wolves are generally wary of fire and reluctant to attack groups, but a hungry enough pack might be willing to test those boundaries. The howl comes again, closer this time, and it's answered by another howl from a different direction. Multiple wolves, which means a pack, which means they're coordinating. Alastair produces a long knife from somewhere in his wrappings. Not a eating knife, a fighting knife, and positions himself near the entrance. The teenage boy has found a stout stick that could serve as a club. Even the elderly woman is holding something that glints metallic in the firelight, ready to defend if necessary. You're acutely aware that this hide tent offers basically zero protection against determined predators. A wolf could rip through the deer skin in seconds if it really wanted to. The only things keeping you safe are the fire, which wolves instinctively fear, and the fact that the pack is probably more interested in easier prey like isolated sheep or deer than in attacking a group of humans in a lit shelter. Probably. The pack circles the area for what feels like hours but is probably only 20 minutes, howling periodically and apparently assessing their options. At one point, you hear something brush against the outside of the tent, and everyone freezes, weapons ready, barely breathing. Then whatever it is moves away, and eventually the howls become more distant, then fade entirely as the pack moves on to hunt elsewhere. The tension in the tent slowly dissipates, but nobody puts their weapons away immediately. Alastair maintains his position near the entrance for another hour, listening intently for any sign of the wolves' return. The experience has driven home exactly how vulnerable you are out here. Just a thin layer of animal skin between you and predators that are perfectly adapted to these conditions and see you as potential prey. The supernatural stories take on a different character after the wolf encounter. Now the elderly woman is telling protective tales. Stories about saints who drove away evil, about charms and prayers that keep households safe, about the importance of maintaining certain rituals to ensure protection. She produces a small object from her clothing, something that looks like a bundle of herbs and feathers tied with thread, and touches it to her forehead while muttering what sounds like a prayer or incantation. This is protective magic, the practical spirituality that helps people cope with genuine dangers they can't control. You can mock superstition from the comfort of modern life, but when you're in a tent in the mountains with wolves circling in winter trying to kill you, suddenly a protective charm doesn't seem quite so ridiculous. At minimum, it provides psychological comfort. At maximum, if there's anything to the folk wisdom encoded in these practices, maybe it actually helps somehow. The children have definitely not been sleeping through any of this, and now they're being comforted and reassured by the adults. The 4-year-old is tucked more securely between protective bodies, and someone starts humming a low tune that's probably a lullaby, though it has a mournful quality that seems at odds with soothing children to sleep. The 7-year-old is wide-eyed and scared, and the elderly woman pulls them close, wrapping her plaid around them and rocking slightly while continuing that mournful humming. The humming gradually includes others. First one voice joins, then another, until several people are creating this harmonious sound that fills the tent and somehow pushes back against the darkness and the fear. It's not quite singing, more like sustained toning, and it creates vibrations you can feel in your chest. This is communal comfort, tribal bonding through shared sound, and it's working. You can feel your own anxiety decreasing as the humming continues. Alastair speaks quietly, and the teenage boy translates. The old songs keep us human. The wolves have their howls, we have our voices. As long as we sing, we remember we're not animals, just surviving. We're people living. It's surprisingly philosophical for someone you initially dismissed as a gruff survivalist, and it makes you reconsider how much depth you've been missing by focusing on the physical hardships and ignoring the psychological and spiritual strategies these people use to endure. The enforced silence periods between stories create a kind of meditation practice. You're forced to sit with your own thoughts, with the discomfort of your position, with the fear and cold and uncertainty, and just exist in it without distraction. No phone to scroll, no music to escape into, no way to avoid being present in this uncomfortable moment. It's intensely unpleasant and probably very good for developing mental resilience, assuming it doesn't just break you first. Something else brushes the outside of the tent. Different sound this time, lighter, and Alastair identifies it with a single word that the teenage boy translates as fox. Less threatening than wolves, but still an indicator of how thin the boundary is between the inside of your shelter and the wild landscape that surrounds it. The fox is probably attracted by the smell of food from your earlier meal, hoping to scavenge scraps, and it will go away when it determines there's nothing easily available. The stories resume, but they're quieter now, more introspective. Tales about endurance, about ancestors who survived worse winters than this one, about springs that eventually came after the darkest times. These are morale stories designed to fortify spirits against despair, and they're clearly effective. You can see people's postures relax slightly. Their expressions soften from grim endurance towards something more like patient waiting. The wind shifts direction, and smoke suddenly fills the tent, sending everyone into coughing fits and scrambling to cover their faces. The teenage boy adjusts something near the smoke hole. You can't see exactly what, and the draft improves, pulling the smoke upward more effectively. Crisis managed, breathing resumes, and the stories continue as if the interruption never happened. This is the rhythm of tent life. Constant small emergencies requiring immediate adjustment, then back to whatever passes for normal. As the night wears on toward morning, though you have no real way to tell time, the stories gradually fade into silence. People drift into actual sleep or that semi-conscious rest state that passes for sleep in these conditions. The fire is maintained at minimal levels to conserve fuel while providing just enough warmth to prevent freezing. The wind continues its assault on the mountains, indifferent to the small pocket of human persistence sheltering beneath its fury. And you lie there in the darkness, listening to breathing and wind and the occasional snap of burning peat, marveling at the fact that people do this night after night, winter after winter, and somehow maintain their sanity and humanity through it all. You've just drifted into something approximating sleep when chaos erupts. There's a tearing sound, a rush of freezing air, and suddenly everyone is shouting in Gaelic and scrambling in the darkness. It takes your disoriented brain several seconds to process what's happening. One section of the tent's hide covering has ripped loose from its bindings, and wind is now pouring through a gap that's rapidly widening as the stressed material pulls away from the framework. Alastair is already moving, barking orders that nobody needs translated because the urgency is universal. The teenage boy lunges for the flapping hide, trying to hold it in place against wind that's hitting with the force of a physical assault. The elderly woman is pushing the children toward the far side of the tent, away from the breach, while simultaneously trying to keep the fire from being extinguished by the sudden draft. You're frozen, literally and figuratively, trying to understand what you're supposed to do while your brain screams that this is exactly the disaster scenario you've been dreading. The temperature inside the tent plummets immediately. What was barely tolerable becomes actively dangerous in seconds as the wind replaces your carefully hoarded warm air with sub-zero fury. Snow begins swirling in through the gap, and you can see outside for the first time since entering the tent. There's nothing visible but white and black and the suggestion of mountains in the darkness. The storm that's been building all night has reached full intensity, and you've just lost your primary protection against it. Alastair is shouting something that sounds like a string of creative cursing while he works to secure the damaged section. He's grabbed a leather strap and is trying to lash the hide back to the framework, but the wind keeps catching the material and ripping it from his grip. The teenage boy has managed to hold one corner in place, his hands already turning white from cold exposure, and he's yelling for someone to bring the repair supplies that are apparently stored somewhere in this chaotic darkness. This is the emergency protocol you never got properly briefed on, the disaster scenario that Highland clans train for because it happens often enough to be a real threat. Tent failures during storms can kill everyone inside, either through exposure when the shelter collapses completely, or through the cascade of secondary problems that follow the initial breach. You need to act, but you have no idea what to do, and your modern disaster training of call 911 and wait for professionals is spectacularly unhelpful right now. The elderly woman thrusts something into your hands, a hide, smaller than the ones forming the tent structure, probably a spare patch kept for exactly this situation. She's gesturing urgently at the gap, and you finally understand. You're supposed to hold this over the breach from the inside while others work to secure it from outside. It's a simple task, theoretically, but the wind is trying to rip the hide from your hands with sustained force that's exhausting to resist. You plant your feet against the ground, lean your full body weight into holding the patch in place, and immediately understand why the teenage boy's hands went white. The cold is transferring through the hide directly into your palms, and the wind is creating such intense pressure that your muscles are trembling with the effort of maintaining your grip. This is emergency repair under the worst possible conditions, and everyone's survival depends on executing it correctly under time pressure while partially frozen and in complete darkness except for the dying fire. Alasdair has made it outside. You can hear him working on the exterior, the sound of bindings being tied, his grunted efforts audible even over the wind. The repair process requires coordinating between inside and outside teams, which would be challenging in daylight with good conditions and is nearly impossible now. The teenage boy is somehow holding his section of hide while also feeding leather straps to Alasdair through the gap, and you're just trying not to let your patch blow away while your fingers lose all sensation. Historians still argue whether the survival rates for tent failures during winter storms were as high as clan oral histories suggest, or whether there's survivorship bias at work. The stories that get remembered are the ones where everyone lived, not the ones where families froze to death. What's clear is that clans developed specific protocols for these emergencies, and executing them correctly was the difference between minor inconvenience and major tragedy. The children are crying now, and you can hear the elderly woman trying to comfort them while also keeping the fire alive with one hand and holding their blankets around them with the other. The 4-year-old is wailing with that panic sound that children make when they know something is genuinely wrong, and it's breaking your heart while also ratcheting up your own fear, because if a child who's lived their whole life in these conditions is scared, you should be absolutely terrified. Something shifts. Alasdair has managed to secure one corner properly, and the flapping reduces slightly. The teenage boy adjusts his grip, taking advantage of the momentary stability to tie his section more permanently. You're still holding your patch in place, your arms screaming with fatigue, when you feel someone working behind you, threading leather straps through holes you didn't know existed in the patch, beginning to lash it to the framework. It's the woman who's been silent most of the night, moving with practiced efficiency even in the chaos. The repair takes maybe 10 minutes total, but it feels like hours. Your hands have gone from painful cold to numb to completely non-functional, and when the woman finally indicates you can let go, you literally cannot open your fingers. They've locked in position from the sustained effort and cold exposure. She has to physically pry your hands open, and the returning circulation brings pain that makes you gasp and tears spring to your eyes. Alasdair crawls back inside through the entrance, covered in snow and breathing hard, and immediately begins checking the other attachment points around the tent's perimeter. This breach was a warning. If one section failed, others might be close to failing too. He's systematically testing every binding, every stress point, identifying weak areas before they become catastrophic. And you're realizing this is the kind of preventative maintenance that should have been done before the storm but probably got skipped due to exhaustion or complacency. The teenage boy is flexing his hands, trying to restore circulation, and even in the dim firelight you can see his fingers are concerning colors. White at the tips, transitioning to angry red, probably the early stages of frostbite. The elderly woman pulls him close to the fire, positioning his hands near but not directly in the heat, and begins massaging them with a technique that looks painful but is probably preventing permanent damage. He doesn't make a sound, just grits his teeth and endures, because complaining about pain is apparently not done when everyone's in crisis mode. Your own hands are throbbing as circulation returns, and you're examining them in the firelight with growing concern. The fingertips are white and waxy looking, completely numb, and you know enough about cold injuries to know this is bad. The elderly woman, seeing your inspection, takes your hands without asking permission and begins the same aggressive massage technique she used on the boy. It hurts worse than anything you've experienced recently, like thousands of needles stabbing simultaneously as blood forces its way back into constricted capillaries. The patch section of tent is holding, but it's clearly a weak point now. The wind is testing it constantly, and you can see the patch billowing inward with each gust, straining against the new bindings. This is temporary stability, not a permanent fix, and everyone knows it. If the storm continues at this intensity, the patch might fail or other sections might give way, and you'll be right back in emergency mode with even fewer resources and more exhausted people trying to hold everything together. Alasdair makes a decision, you can see it in his face, and begins organizing a more comprehensive reinforcement effort. Using spare hides from the supply pile, leather straps from equipment, and what looks like sections of someone's clothing sacrificed for the cause, he's creating additional support structures for the most vulnerable sections of the tent. It's engineering improvised under pressure, using whatever materials are available, and it's surprisingly sophisticated for someone working by firelight with frozen hands. The emergency has revealed the pecking order and role assignments that exist within the group. Highlander is clearly the leader, making final decisions and taking the most dangerous tasks. The teenage boy is his lieutenant, executing orders and filling in wherever needed. The elderly woman is managing the children and the fire, equally critical tasks that require someone trustworthy. The silent woman is the repair specialist, the one with the technical skills for fixing things. Everyone else has supporting roles based on their capabilities. You're the useless outsider who barely managed to hold a patch in place and nearly lost your fingers doing it. It's humbling and also clarifying. These people have been training for this their entire lives, building skills through repetition and necessity, and you've been dropped into their world with none of the prerequisite knowledge or physical conditioning. Your survival is entirely dependent on their competence and willingness to keep you alive despite being a liability. The reinforcement work takes another hour, and by the time it's done, everyone is exhausted beyond exhausted. The children have cried themselves into whimpering silence. The adults are moving slowly, mechanically, operating on whatever reserves they have left. The fire has been neglected during the crisis and is barely alive. Just a few struggling coals that the elderly woman is desperately nursing back to sustainability with the last pieces of easily accessible peat. Highlander does a final inspection of the repairs, testing each binding by pulling on it with his full strength, checking for any give or weakness. He finds 2 points that aren't secure enough and redoes them completely, even though everyone is obviously desperate to stop working and rest. This is the discipline that keeps people alive. Not accepting good enough when secure is what's actually required, even when you're exhausted and hurt and just want to be done. The storm outside hasn't diminished at all. If anything, it sounds worse, the wind now sustained at a level that makes the entire tent vibrate constantly. You're acutely aware that you're in a structure held together by leather straps and hope, surrounded by weather that could kill you in minutes if the shelter fails completely. The buffer between survival and death is measured in the thickness of animal hides and the integrity of knots tied by frozen fingers in darkness. Someone, you're not sure who, starts a prayer or chant, something rhythmic and repetitive in Gaelic that others join. It's not the earlier humming but something more urgent, more desperate, a plea for protection or endurance directed at whatever deity or force they believe might be listening. The sound fills the tent, creating a sense of solidarity and shared purpose, reminding everyone that they're in this together and that the group's survival depends on each person continuing to function. The prayer transitions into silence, and in that silence, you hear it. A deep groaning sound from the framework, the protest of wood and hide and bindings being stressed beyond their design limits. Everyone freezes, listening, trying to determine if this is normal settling or the precursor to catastrophic failure. The groan fades, the tent holds, and breathing resumes. But now you're all listening with heightened attention, monitoring for any sound that might indicate the next emergency. The teenage boy is assigned to fire watch with explicit instructions to wake everyone immediately if anything seems wrong with the shelter. He nods acceptance, settling into position with his eyes already heavy but his jaw set with determination. The rest of you arrange yourselves back into sleeping positions, though sleep seems wildly optimistic given the circumstances. You're cold, wet from the snow that came in during the breach, hurting from the repair work, and absolutely certain that disaster is going to strike again before dawn. But somehow, impossibly, the tent holds. The repairs hold. The storm rages outside, and the wind tests every weakness, and the cold creeps in through every gap, but the fundamental structure maintains its integrity. Hours pass in fitful half-sleep, jolting awake at every sound, checking that the fire's still alive, that everyone's still breathing, that the world hasn't ended while you briefly lost consciousness. This is what emergency protocols in a Highland winter mean. Not orderly evacuation procedures or professional rescue services, but desperate improvisation with inadequate tools, ordinary people doing extraordinary things to survive, and the constant awareness that you're balanced on the knife edge between making it through the night and becoming another cautionary tale told around future fires. When dawn finally arrives, it doesn't announce itself with light. Not really. The darkness inside the tent transitions from absolute black to murky gray so gradually that you're not sure when the change actually happened. There's no sunrise to see through the hide walls, just a slow, grudging acknowledgement that the Earth has rotated enough to bring theoretical daylight to this part of Scotland, though the storm clouds are apparently blocking most of it. The wind has finally diminished from catastrophic to merely miserable, which everyone seems to consider a major improvement. You haven't actually slept. You've spent the night in that exhausted limbo where your body desperately needs rest, but your brain refuses to fully shut down, convinced that the moment you lose consciousness, something terrible will happen. Every muscle aches from the combination of cold, tension, and the emergency repair work. Your fingers are swollen and painful, the early frostbite damage making them clumsy and hypersensitive to touch. Your throat is raw from breathing smoke all night. Your eyes are gritty and inflamed, and your head is pounding from what's probably mild carbon monoxide poisoning combined with dehydration and stress. And this is just the beginning of another day. Alastair is already awake. You're not sure he ever actually slept, and he's conducting a morning assessment of the tent's condition. The patches from last night are holding, but they're clearly temporary solutions that will need more comprehensive repair work before they can be trusted long-term. The snow banking around the tent's exterior has been partially blown away by the storm, reducing the insulation value and allowing more cold to penetrate. The framework itself survived intact, but several of the binding points show stress damage that needs addressing. The teenage boy is working to rebuild the fire from the barely alive coals, feeding it carefully selected pieces of peat and blowing gently to encourage flames. This delicate work. Too much air and you scatter the coals, too little and they die completely. He's clearly done this hundreds of times, and within a few minutes he's coaxed the fire back to sustainable life, though it's producing more smoke than usual, probably because the peat got damp during last night's breach. Everyone is moving slowly, stiffly, with the careful movements of people whose bodies have been pushed to their limits. The elderly woman is coughing more this morning, that wet, congested sound that makes you think about pneumonia and the fact that respiratory infections in these conditions can quickly become fatal. The children are quiet, subdued, their earlier fear having settled into a kind of resigned wariness. The silent woman who did the repair work is checking her own hands, flexing fingers that show the same frostbite warning signs you're seeing on yours. Breakfast is a grim affair. More oatcakes, some of the crowdie that's starting to smell questionable, and a portion of something that might be dried fish. You're honestly not sure, and you're too exhausted to care. You chew mechanically, forcing food into a stomach that's protesting the entire concept of eating. The bland makes another appearance, and you drink it without complaint this time because you're desperately thirsty and it's marginally better than trying to melt snow in your mouth. The real problem becomes apparent when Alastair ventures outside to assess the storm damage and returns with news that's clearly bad even before the teenage boy translates it. The storm has deposited several feet of new snow around the tent, essentially burying the lower portions and creating drifts that reach partway up the sides. The entrance tunnel is completely blocked and had to be dug out just so Alastair could exit and re-enter. The landscape beyond has been transformed into a featureless white expanse where landmarks have disappeared and navigation would be essentially impossible. You're snowed in. Completely, thoroughly snowed in, with no idea how long it will take for conditions to improve enough to move. The peat supply that seemed adequate yesterday is now looking worryingly finite when measured against an unknown number of additional days stuck in this tent. The food supplies are similarly concerning. There's enough for maybe 3 more days of the minimal rations you've been eating, less if you're here longer or if people need more calories to combat the cold. This is the scenario that kills people. Not the dramatic catastrophes like tent collapse or wolf attacks, but the slow attrition of being trapped in barely adequate shelter with diminishing resources while the weather refuses to cooperate. Hypothermia sets in gradually as fuel runs low and the tent gets colder. Malnutrition weakens immune systems until minor respiratory infections become major problems. Mental state deteriorates as hope fades and the psychological weight of confinement and discomfort becomes unbearable. Alastair is making calculations, you can see it in his face, assessing supplies against time, weighing the risks of staying versus the risks of attempting to move in poor conditions. He's speaking with the elderly woman in low tones, probably consulting her experience and judgment. The teenage boy is listening intently, learning how decisions get made in survival situations, understanding that leadership means choosing between bad options and living with the consequences. The morning routine, such as it is, involves checking everyone's extremities for frostbite damage. Alasdair examines each person's hands and feet systematically, looking for the telltale signs of tissue damage, numbness, discoloration, loss of sensation. Your fingers get particular attention, and his expression when examining them suggests they're worse than you hoped but not as bad as they could be. He says something in Gaelic that the teenage boy translates as, "You'll probably keep them, but they'll hurt for weeks." The children's feet are a concern. The 7-year-old has 2 toes that are showing white patches, and the elderly woman immediately begins aggressive warming techniques, tucking the child's feet against her own stomach to transfer body heat while massaging gently to encourage circulation. It's intimate and practical and completely unself-conscious, the kind of care that happens naturally in communities where survival depends on everyone looking after everyone else. Your own feet are mostly intact, though your toes are numb and painful and probably suffering some degree of cold damage. The dried grass in your brogues has become compressed into damp, useless mat, and Alasdair provides fresh grass from the dwindling supply while making it clear through gestures and tone that you need to be more attentive to changing it regularly. Your survival is your own responsibility, even when you don't know what you're doing, and people can only save you from yourself so many times before resources or patience run out. The snow blindness risk becomes apparent when Alasdair returns from another brief expedition outside and his eyes are streaming, red and inflamed. Even the brief exposure to reflected sunlight off new snow has damaged his eyes, and the elderly woman treats him with some kind of preparation, probably soot mixed with fat, that she applies around his eyes to reduce glare and inflammation. Snow blindness is temporary but painful and incapacitating, and it's another of those risks that Highland clans manage through accumulated knowledge. Don't stare at snow in bright conditions, limit time outside during high glare periods, use whatever eye protection you can improvise. Historians still argue whether Highland clans used primitive snow goggles made from wood or leather with narrow slits to reduce glare, similar to what Arctic peoples developed independently. The evidence is mixed, but what's clear is that they understood the risk and took it seriously, because being temporarily blinded in winter conditions could be a death sentence if it happened at a critical moment. The tent itself is showing signs of the night's stresses. The hides that seemed adequate yesterday now have visible gaps where the material has shrunk or shifted. The smoke hole has accumulated ice around its edges, reducing its effectiveness and causing more smoke backup into the tent. The floor covering is damp in several places where snow infiltrated during the breach and subsequently melted. Everything feels slightly less secure, slightly more precarious, and you're beginning to understand that shelters don't maintain themselves. They require constant attention and adjustment or they degrade rapidly. The repair work that needs to happen today includes repacking the snow banking, tightening all the binding points, reinforcing the patches from last night, clearing ice from the smoke hole, replacing damp floor coverings, checking the framework for stress damage, and somehow accomplishing all of this while conserving energy and staying warm enough to function. It's a full day's work in brutal conditions, and everyone is already exhausted before starting. Alasdair organizes work parties. Some people stay inside maintaining the fire and preparing food. Others venture out in shifts to handle external repairs, rotating regularly so nobody gets too cold from prolonged exposure. You're assigned to inside duty, partly because you're still useless for complex tasks and partly because your fingers aren't reliable enough for the detail work that external repairs require. Your job is to feed the fire, keep it alive but not wasteful, and try not to screw up the one task that's literally keeping everyone from freezing. The day passes in a blur of small tasks and constant discomfort. The wind picks up again mid-morning, undoing some of the external repair work and requiring people to go back out and redo it. The elderly woman's cough worsens, and she's now spending more time resting than working, which means others have to pick up her tasks. The 4-year-old develops a fever. You can tell by the flushed face and glassy eyes, and the silent woman tends to them with resources that amount to basically keeping them warm and hoping their immune system handles whatever infection is developing. Lunch is skipped because conserving food seems more important than maintaining meal schedules. Dinner, when it comes, is even more minimal than previous meals. The supplies are being rationed hard now, stretched to accommodate the possibility of being trapped here for days more. You get a portion that's maybe 2/3 of what you had yesterday, and it's not enough to satisfy hunger, just enough to keep your body minimally fueled. The psychological toll of being trapped is becoming visible in everyone's behavior. The children are fretful and clingy, unable to play or expend energy in the confined space. The adults are shorter-tempered, snapping at minor frustrations, struggling to maintain the cooperative spirit that's essential for group survival. The elderly woman has withdrawn into herself, conserving energy, and you wonder if she's making calculations about her own survival chances versus the burden she's placing on the group's resources. As the second night in the tent approaches, though you've lost track of whether it's actually the second night or if you've somehow been here longer, the temperature drops again, and everyone huddles closer to the struggling fire. The peat supply is now visibly low, maybe enough for 2 more days at current consumption rates. The conversation has died almost completely, replaced by grim silence broken only by necessary communication. Everyone knows the situation is getting desperate, and nobody wants to voice it aloud. The teenage boy takes first watch for the night, and you settle into your damp, uncomfortable sleeping spot, your body aching and your mind running through worst-case scenarios. The wind outside has returned to full intensity, and you can hear it testing the repairs, probing for weaknesses, patient and relentless and completely indifferent to the suffering of the tiny pocket of human resistance sheltering beneath its assault. You're cold enough that you're not sure you'll survive another night, exhausted enough that you're not sure you care, and just aware enough to understand that this is exactly how people die in winter mountains, not dramatically, but through accumulated misery that eventually becomes too much to endure. And yet, somehow the night passes, the tent holds, the fire survives. Morning comes again, gray and grudging and offering no promises of improvement, but at least confirming that you've made it through another night. The elderly woman is still breathing, though her cough sounds worse. The feverish child has stabilized, the fever breaking during the night. Your fingers hurt less, which either means they're healing or you've lost enough nerve function that you can't feel the damage anymore. Highlander ventures outside for the morning assessment and returns with the first piece of genuinely good news in what feels like forever. The storm is breaking. The wind has diminished significantly, the snow has stopped falling, and there are actual breaks in the clouds where pale sunlight is struggling through. It might be possible to move today or tomorrow to dig out of this position and make for lower elevations where conditions are less severe and resources more available. The mood in the tent shifts immediately. People who were barely functional suddenly have energy for tasks. Preparations begin for potential departure. Gear is checked, supplies are organized, routes are discussed. The children sense the adults' relief and become more animated, their resilience rebounding the moment there's hope of change. Even the elderly woman seems to rally, sitting up and taking more interest in the preparations. But you've learned enough to know that might be possible to move is very different from definitely moving, and that conditions in the highlands can change rapidly. The breaking storm could return. New obstacles could emerge. Someone could be too injured or sick to travel safely. Nothing is certain, and celebrating prematurely would be tempting fate in an environment that's already demonstrated its capacity for cruelty. Still, after the night you've endured, even the possibility of escape feels like a gift. You flex your damaged fingers, test your frozen toes, and try to calculate whether your body can handle the demands of travel through deep snow in extreme cold. You're not sure, but you're also increasingly certain that staying in this tent much longer will break something fundamental in your psyche, and that might be worse than whatever physical damage the journey causes. The morning light continues to strengthen, and through the smoke hole you can actually see sky, actual blue sky, the first color besides white and gray and the orange of firelight that you've seen since entering this tent. It's absurdly beautiful, that tiny circle of blue, and you find yourself staring at it with an intensity that's probably disproportionate to what amounts to normal weather. But nothing about this experience has been normal, and your baseline for what constitutes a miracle has shifted dramatically. Highlander makes the final decision. They'll attempt to depart tomorrow morning, giving today for final preparations and rest, allowing time for the snow to settle slightly and for everyone to mentally prepare for the difficult journey ahead. It's the kind of measured, careful decision-making that's kept him and his clan alive through who knows how many Highland winters, and you're grateful to be benefiting from his experience even as you realize you'll soon be facing a whole new set of survival challenges during the actual travel. For now, though, there's this one more day in the tent, knowing it's temporary, knowing escape is coming. The fire gets fed with slightly less anxiety about fuel conservation. The midday meal is marginally larger, celebrating the impending departure. People speak more, Share stories about where they'll go and what they'll do once they reach lower ground and relative safety. It's still miserable, still uncomfortable, still dangerous, but the psychological weight has lifted enough that it feels survivable again. You made it through the Highlander Snow Tent, barely, with damaged fingers and traumatized lungs and memories that will probably fuel nightmares for years. But you made it, and that's more than many people could claim. The tent that seemed like flimsy nothing when you first crawled into it has kept you alive through conditions that would have killed you in hours without it. The people who seemed like rough survivalists have revealed themselves as sophisticated practitioners of skills you never knew existed. And you've learned more about human endurance and community survival in 2 nights than you learned in years of comfortable modern life. Tomorrow, you'll face the next challenge. Actually traveling through Highland winter with a group of people who are exhausted, injured, and operating on minimal resources. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, you're still in the tent, still breathing, still part of this small community of survivors who've shared smoke and fear and cold and stories and have somehow made it through together. The fire crackles, sending sparks toward the smoke hole where they wink out against the circle of blue sky. The elderly woman starts humming one of those low, mournful tunes that you've learned mean comfort and continuity. The children settle close to the adults, secure in the knowledge that morning will come and bring change with it. And you close your eyes, not quite sleeping but not quite awake, letting the exhaustion finally pull you under while your body does its best to heal from the accumulated damage of surviving what you now understand was never meant to be survived comfortably, only endured with whatever dignity and community you can maintain through the darkness. The wind outside has gentled to a whisper, no longer threatening, just the mountain breathing in and out, ancient and patient and completely unconcerned with the small human dramas playing out in high tents across its slopes. Winter will continue. Spring will eventually come, and the cycle will repeat, season after season, generation after generation, until the last Highland clan finally abandons these mountains for easier lands where survival doesn't require quite so much suffering. But for tonight, in this moment, you're here. You're alive. You've witnessed something most modern people will never experience. The absolute minimum conditions necessary to sustain human life, the thin line between civilization and nature, the essential truth that comfort is a luxury and survival is the only currency that actually matters when the wind howls and the snow falls and the darkness closes in around a struggling fire in a tent made of dead animals in the middle of nowhere. And somehow, impossibly, incredibly, that's enough. It has to be, because this is what it means to last a day, and a night, and another day, in a Highlander snow tent. Not thriving, not enjoying, just enduring, together, until the storm passes and the journey can continue. Sweet dreams indeed. The light is fading now in your own safe room, wherever you are in the world. Your blankets are clean and warm. Your walls are solid. Your heat is reliable. And you're so far from that tent in the mountains, that circle of firelight where people fought for every breath of warm air and every hour of survival. Let those images soften now. Let the wind die down to silence. Let the cold recede into memory. You're here, now, safe and comfortable, with nothing more demanding than sleep ahead of you. The Highlanders made it through their winters. You've made it through their story. And tomorrow you'll wake up to your own warm morning, in your own soft bed, with your own simple comforts that suddenly seem like the greatest luxuries in the world. Rest now. Let go. The tent has done its job. The story has wound down. And sleep is waiting with gentle hands to carry you away from the mountains and into dreams that are kinder than Highland winters ever were. Sleep well wherever you are. You've earned it.